as you may have seen, and again, there was a great discussion going on about it. I posted that example of just to kind of explain how Jung talks about some of these things, where I grabbed an example from, I think it was an article from almost 2 years ago now, talking about how during the pandemic and coming out of the pandemic, we saw a big trend of kind of what they called the childcare crisis, which was just people having to go back to work suddenly, but then having this kind of collapse of the pre-existing childcare system, right? Or people couldn't afford it, or those places had closed and gone out of business, or there was still health concerns, right, with kids going into places or having to stay home and things like that. And what was happening throughout across the country in many families was that women were ending up, somebody was having to stay home with the kids, basically. Right? And the article was talking about the fact that more often than not, it was the in heterosexual couples, it was women who were staying home. And again, we can talk about the fact that an article like that is really focused on these binary attitudes towards gender and heterosexuality as kind of a quote unquote norm, and all the issues, obviously, that all the problems that exist with that kind of thinking. But that's, the article was talking about the fact that in those particular kinds of families, it was the woman having ultimately staying at home, giving up their job to stay home with the kids as a result of this childcare crisis. And I presented it as, well, this is an example of exploitation as Jung talks about it. And if we go back to Jung's definition of exploitation, right, she does, and again, like I said, there was a great discussion, and I don't want to kind of come and say, well, this is the way to think about it, but I did just want to respond to it a little bit because there were some other questions that followed as well. It's the act of one group using the other group's labor to produce profit. This is a very kind of Marxist approach to thinking, while not compensating them fairly. Right? That's ultimately the kind of exploitation she's thinking about, right? Again, where the dominant group benefits from the labor of the oppressed group and doesn't recognize or value, right, or compensate that group adequately. And I get that some people kind of take issue with my kind of presentation of that. I would still think, and I don't mean to suggest, and this goes back to the question of intentionality that I discussed in a previous clip that folks had a question about. I don't mean to suggest that within those families where that happened, that the men were always, at least as a norm, kind of tyrannical, authoritarian. You're going to stop and stay home and take care of the kids, right? We're going to go back to this mode of thinking. But in the larger sense of a society in which women are on average paid less, in which women are on average seen as the carers of children, right? Again, all back under this mode of kind of binary gender thinking, right? Which again is problematic. But the structure that's in place, that patriarchal structure that's in place, which is that it's the woman's job to take care of the kids. My suggestion was we saw kind of a resurgence of that similar kind of exploitation that has been the benchmark of heterosexual society, couples for a very long time in our history. So that was kind of my approach to that. But again, I think people had a lot of good points about that. I mean, again, sometimes maybe it is just a matter of who makes more, right? And who stays home. Is that then exploitation? And again, I think ultimately that kind of thing, and I think maybe this was maybe part of the issue, right? On a family by family basis, maybe not, it just depends on how they handled it, right? How that, if they came to a reasonable conclusion that, hey, you make more than me, so I'll stay home, or hey, you have better health care benefits, so I'll give up my job and lose my benefits, or your long-term job prospects are better than my long-term job prospects, so again, I'll kind of step back. Right? But again, in a larger sense, I would suggest that it's not necessarily exploitation within that family structure, but the society as a whole, in which women are paid less, in which women are not given as many opportunities for advancement often in their careers, right? In which women do have to struggle often more than their male counterparts. I think that is a demonstration of oppression, and again, even of exploitation and therefore oppression. But again, even as I'm talking about this, the questions that others have come up with, which is what about the idea of intersectionality? What about the idea of people within having these different aspects of their existence, right? And how does that fit into this dynamic? And I think one of the problems that you run in with, and I think Young just kind of ignores it, I don't think it was on her radar, is that it's a lot more complicated than just that, right? It's a lot more complicated than just male and female. It's a lot more complicated than just black or white. It's a lot more complicated than this A or B, right? There's very little in the world that actually falls into kind of the construction of A versus B, right? It's a lot more complicated than that. So I don't know, I doubt I've answered any of those questions about that point, but that was, and again, I kind of threw it in there as kind of a quick little demonstration, and probably should have spent a little more time talking about it, but I would suggest that on a grand scale of American society, which still holds this very binary and patriarchal structure, right, which men are paid more and treated differently in the workforce than women on average, then that system itself is exploitative of women by forcing them to have to choose to stay home with their kids as opposed to being able to continue working.